Good afternoon, dear colleagues and friends and Saul. Good afternoon again. Uh, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our conference today. And I would like again to express my appreciation to Saul for making time to be with us today, because it's unbelievable for me that I, the students in Moscow, can invite him and he accept my investigation. So it, I'm a little bit confused, but I'm so happy. I'm so happy to see you now today in our conference. So uh, again, our uh, schedule. Your presentation should take about 45 minutes.
Mm.
And after that, will be questions from our audience. So I think it's okay. So for those who may not be familiar with our guest and his works, I think we all are familiar with it, but again, we should ask, we should think, phew, we should um, say about Saul and his works. Saul is a professor, British political theorist, and professor of politics at Goldsmith, London. So he is recognized for pioneering the concept of post-anarchism, uh, and he coined this term to describe new post-statist forms of political activism and has developed it through his extensive scholarship. So his interests lies in area of anarchism, post-structuralism, Max Stirner's philosophy, and other uh, areas. So uh, I think you can start.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the kind invitation. It's a real thrill actually to be talking to some post-anarchists and Stoner enthusiasts in Russia of all places. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there myself, but anyway. So I want to give a talk based on a paper that I actually wrote some time ago, which is on Max Stirner's concept of ownness. I'm not sure how familiar your audience is with Max Stirner in general. Actually, I mean, hopefully you have some familiarity with him. So he was a 19th century German philosopher. He was one of the key members of the young Hegelian movement, along with Marx and Bruno Bauer and many other influential philosophers. But I think he's also been quite sadly underrated and forgotten in sort of the history of philosophy. And I think he's probably one of the most radical thinkers that's within that tradition. He's probably most closely associated with some form of individualist anarchism, but I don't think that category really kind of captures what he's on about actually. So I've been working on Max Stirner for a long time. I've published quite a lot on Stirner, and looking at his thought from different angles and so on. I mean, you mentioned my work on Max Stirner's concept of the insurrection, which I've also written quite a lot about, which I think is a fascinating way of understanding radical politics. But anyway, so this talk will be on his conception of ownness as an alternative to the idea of liberty or freedom. Uh, so let's get the paper up. Okay, so what I want to do really is kind of look at how Max Stirner's notion of ownness goes beyond our kind of standard paradigms of freedom. So it goes beyond negative liberty, goes beyond positive liberty, and also goes beyond, I think, the Republican model of freedom. So I think he developed something which is actually quite radical and quite innovative, which I think I want to try to relate to well, not only to post-anarchism but also to some of Foucault's work on subjectivation, which I'll talk about at the end. Anyway, so in his lectures at the Collège de France from 1978 to 1979, under the title Birth of Biopolitics, Michel Foucault explored, which with astonishing prescience, actually, given the time which he was writing, he explored the emergence of neoliberalism as a new form of governmental reason, or rather a new version of the liberal art of government, which has started to pervade North American and European societies. So rather than seeing liberalism as an ideology of individual rights and freedoms, Foucault insisted that it should be understood primarily as a way of governing individuals according to the rationality of the market. So in this sense, freedom did not mark the degree to which we are unconstrained. Rather, freedom, which is essentially reduced to market freedom, becomes the mode by which we are governed and the threshold upon which our actions are conducted. And neoliberalism is kind of a radicalization of this liberal logic, and that it seeks to economize every sphere of life. And so far from being a principle of laissez-faire, neoliberalism actually implies more intensive forms of state intervention and regulation aimed at remaking society and the economy in the image of the market. And this new mode of government, according to Foucault, penetrates into the very soul of the individual. The individual is remade as homo economicus, or the entrepreneur of himself. And all human relations under neoliberalism become economized and a potential source of capital. And the market becomes the ultimate site of legitimacy and what Foucault calls veridiction, or the establishment of truth. So while Foucault sees the homo economicus of liberal thought as limiting the traditional power of the sovereign even more profoundly than homo juridicus, also the man of rights, and so on, we must not suppose that homo economicus is a free subject. Not only is his formal freedom always shadowed by the mechanisms of control and securitization, but in seeing himself as his own enterprise, he becomes permanently accountable to the market norms and social processes which produce him. And as Wendy Brown argues in her analysis of neoliberal governing power, Homo economicus is not so much a creation of economic interest, but rather a unit of responsibilized human capital. And she refers to the sacrificial citizen. So the citizen under neoliberalism is routinely called upon to sacrifice his or her own interests in the name of the obscure market forces and economic exigencies over which he has no control. And this, she talks about the way in which this kind of sacrificial expectation is also what breeds resentment, which is directed not toward neoliberal economic policies, but rather against, immigrants and minorities, and it kind of, finds its form really in today's authoritarian right-wing populism, which itself, interestingly, mobilizes under the obscure banner of freedom. And this is precisely why, the whole concept of freedom is so ambiguous today. We don't quite know what it is, and this is why I think, or where I think Stirner can actually shed some light on some of these questions. So Max Stirner also recognized the sacrificial dimension in liberal societies in terms which seem to prefigure Foucault. Stirner sees what he calls political liberalism as a governing rationality, which, while supposedly being about protecting the individual from sovereign power and religious authority, essentially incorporates the individual into the state. So he says, in The Ego on Its Own, he says, in quotes, political liberty means that the polis, or the state, is free. It does not mean my liberty, but the liberty of the power that rules and subjugates me. So what he says is that the freedom promised by liberalism is actually the freedom of the state, not the freedom of the individual. And this is really part of the broader problem in modern societies, as Stirner sees it. So, he argues that, the humanist and rationalist philosophy, which was quite prevalent at his time, particularly that of his contemporary Ludwig Feuerbach, was simply Christianity invented in a new secular guise, where the individual is sacrificed no longer on the altar of God, but now of man. So Stirner says, in quotes, man is the God of today, and the fear of man has taken the place of the old fear of God. Right? So the individual in this new secular and humanist age is plagued by what Max Stirner calls fixed ideas, which are sort of moral and rational abstractions or ideals or norms which the individual is expected to conform to and sacrifice himself to. Humanism and its political expression in liberalism, and as well as republicanism and socialism, is a profoundly sacrificial ideology in which individuals, in their uniqueness and singularity, are coercively absorbed into abstract, alienating generalities, namely humanity, society, and the state. So Stirner's answer to this lay in the abandonment of the goal of freedom. So he believes that the ideal of freedom is essentially exhausted. It has reached a point of exhaustion. It's been fundamentally tarnished or corrupted, if you like, by liberal ideology and Christian theology. And he proposes instead this concept of ownness. And I'll say a bit more about what ownness actually means in a moment. So the value of Stirner's critique of freedom lies in enabling us to rethink the concept in response to neoliberalism. In my view, neoliberalism, if we can still call it that today, maybe we're now in a fully sort of post-liberal age, but anyway, neoliberalism, in my view, is more effectively contested or resisted not on the grounds of equality, nor from the perspective of democracy, as someone like Wendy Brown would say, but rather on its own terms, which are those of individual freedom. So my point, quite simply, is that neoliberalism is, which claims to be about individual freedom, really has nothing to do with individual freedom at all. It's actually a reduction or a sacrifice of individual freedom. Stirner not only reveals the inadequacy of liberal and neoliberal accounts of freedom, but presents a far more radical alternative to them, one that serves as a point of resistance to dominant modes of subjectification. Now, it might seem odd in some ways to look to a thinker who is at times interpreted, although I would say wrongly, in my view, as promoting a kind of a free market form of self-interest. I mean, I think this is a complete misinterpretation of Stirner, but this is sort of the kind of the stereotype view of Stirner, that he's really promoting this kind of free market individualism. Does it not seem perverse to choose egoism as a basis of a critique of neoliberal societies? However, Stirner would consider the individual freedom proclaimed by neoliberalism as a kind of a trap, a logic that reduces the individual to an infinite conformability with the norms of society. In this sense, the problem of neoliberalism is not too much egoism, but too little. Stirner's philosophy of ownness, or individual autonomy, are utterly incompatible with liberal or neoliberal or understanding of the possessive individualism. His egoist is simply not the same thing as Homo economicus. So the problem, according to Stirner, when we talk about freedom, is we turn freedom into an ideal which we try to attain or live up to, right? So, freedom becomes this kind of moral norm. And doing this, we also attach it to an institutional regime or a form of society, right? So, only liberal societies can give us freedom, or only a liberal state can kind of give us freedom. And what Stirner argues is that it's this kind of normalization of freedom which basically alienates freedom from the individual. And this is why, according to Stirner, freedom appears to us moderns increasingly as an empty, hollow dream or a mystification. By contrast, ownness, which he understands as a kind of a radical form of self-ownership, is much more tangible to the individual. Ownness may be seen as a form of freedom no longer dependent upon external conditions, whether these are the actions of others or one's conformity with an externally imposed moral and rational ideal, or dependent upon the presence of a regime of law that supposedly guarantees non-domination, as Republicans would argue. Such conditions remove the capacity for freedom from real individuals. Behind every ideal of freedom, there lurks, according to Stirner, a new form of domination. As it's always someone's particular idea of freedom that that is being imposed upon the world. So he says, in quotes, the craving for a particular freedom always includes the purpose of a new dominion or a new domination. And this is why Stirner is also quite suspicious of the idea of revolution or revolutionary emancipation, or indeed of any kind of emancipation other than self-emancipation, right? So, the problem with emancipation is it kind of imposes a certain kind of collective vision of freedom upon society. And, he would say this is just simply another kind of domination, essentially. So it's up to the individual to liberate herself. Ownness seeks to make freedom real by placing it back within the grasp of real individuals who are free to create their own singular path of freedom. So there's a deeper problem with emancipation, according to Stirner. For Stirner, there is, in a sense, nothing to emancipate. And this is where I refer to ontological freedom. The individual is already free in an ontological sense because she has ownness, because she is her own. So the owner, for Stirner, is in quotes, free-born, the man free to begin with. Whereas the man who seeks freedom is simply a dreamer chasing after illusions. Right? So unlike the sacrificial subject, the owner takes himself as his own axiom and regards freedom not as an external goal to be obtained, but rather as his permanent ontological condition. Freedom for Stirner should be a question of self-empowerment and the recognition and affirmation of one's own self as the condition and measure of freedom, rather than being dependent upon any external condition. Now, Stirner makes a number of important distinctions here between ownness and, let's say, the liberal negative conception of freedom. So the problem with negative freedom is it gives you freedom from something. So it gives you freedom from external interference and constraints, but it also leaves you with nothing. It doesn't give you anything, right? It is thus, according to Stirner, an empty experience. And he says in quotes, and if you become free from everything, you would no longer have anything, for freedom is empty of substance. So while one can become free from many things, we might actually want to have something, to possess something, to consume something, and to enjoy it. So that's really his problem with the kind of the liberal conception of negative freedom, right? It's essentially, it just kind of gives you freedom from something without actually kind of giving you anything, essentially. Now, on the other hand, Stirner does not subscribe to the view of freedom as a kind of a normative condition. So Stirner avoids prescriptive statements about how much freedom one should have or what kinds of freedoms one should have. He would reject claims that one is free only insofar as one acts in a certain way, or that legitimate interests are really no constraint at all. He does not qualitatively evaluate different types of freedom. From a perspective of Stirner's nominalism, freedom has no independent value. It can only be determined by the self and the self's particular interests. So behind every demand for liberty, there is not some sort of universal normative idea, according to Stirner, but there's only self-interest. Thus, if freedom always presupposes that which is good for oneself, rather than a social and moral ideal, the self can be the only real measure of freedom. And this is why Stirner says it's better to have ownness. So how does Stirner actually understand ownness? He says in quotes, what a difference between freedom and ownness. One can get rid of a great many things, not from everything. Ownness, on the contrary, is my whole being and existence. It is I, myself. I am free from what I am rid of, but owner of what I have in my power or what I control. My own I am at all times and under all circumstances, if I know how to have myself and do not throw myself away on others. Right? So ownness for Stirner is a much more tangible and real form of freedom. It's more affirmative than negative freedom in the sense that it's an expression of the individual's own power and capacity. And it's something that the individual has as part of her very existence, regardless of the external constraints one finds oneself under. Now, Stirner also differs, I would say, quite significantly from the theory of freedom proposed as an alternative to liberal negative freedom, which is that of the Republican theory of freedom as non-domination. And this is associated with thinkers like Quentin Skinner and Philip Pettit, who've argued that the Republican or neo-Roman tradition of political thought isolated a specific understanding of liberty that referred to a more general notion of the security of freedom, or what Pettit refers to as resilient non-interference. And the chief problem for the proponent of negative liberty, as we know, is interference as such, whereas the chief problem for the proponent of Republican liberty is arbitrary interference, right? So in other words, for the Republican, what limits the liberty of an individual is not that she is interfered with by another, because they would say there might be many forms of interference which are either to the benefit of the individual or which are sanctioned by a stable and democratically agreed system of rules or laws. Rather, what does limit freedom unduly is living under an arbitrary relationship of power, in which the threat of interference and constraint, while not always or ever actualized, is nevertheless always hanging over her head. And this is how Republicans understand domination. So they give the example of the slave, right? So the slave, they say, imagine a slave who lives under the control of a master who does not constrain or unduly interfere with the slave's day-to-day activities, whether out of benevolence or inattentiveness. The proponent of negative freedom, the slave, is strictly speaking free because the slave is not being interfered with. Whereas for the advocate of Republican freedom, the slave is unfree because he lives under an unequal and arbitrary form of power that renders him vulnerable to the whims of his master. Right? The slave never knows when his master might, for whatever reason, start to interfere and constrain him, and there are no guarantees that he will not do so. So in other words, the slave enjoys no security of liberty. And this is a point which is also made by someone like Quentin Skinner as well, actually. So you can see the how Republicans understand freedom. Freedom is non-domination as opposed to non-interference. Okay, now what would Stirner have to say about this? I mean, Stirner was very critical of various aspects of Republican theory, particularly as it was understood by his contemporaries like Bruno Bauer. The problem, he would say, with republicanism is it actually sanctions forms of interference which are, which kind of justified because they're produced under a stable system of laws, right? So what Republicans would say is, you can still have, a system of punishments and coercions as long as these are not arbitrary, as long as these are sanctioned by, by laws which are, which are well understood and well established and so on. And so what Stirner would say is this is obviously still a form of coercion. This is obviously still a constraint upon freedom. Right. So, the fact that a certain constraint is sanctioned by the law does not justify it or does not mean that it's not a limitation on freedom. So there's a lot of contradictions, he would say, with the Republican theory of freedom. So, so the second problem with republicanism, according to Stirner, is that it ends up disempowering the individual by sacrificing his freedom to an abstract ideal which is determined by external factors. So in considering the problem of domination, Stirner reflects on the master-slave relationship, which for Republicans was was like the ultimate form of unfreedom. Stirner seeks to show by contrast that while the slave may not have much freedom, he nevertheless has ownness. And this is the one thing which his master cannot take away from him. So in this situation, Stirner would say that the subject has very little or no freedom on either the Republican or the negative account, right? So if you think about the slave is unfree from the Republican point of view, but also or can be unfree from the kind of the negative liberal point of view as well. The individual slave is both physically interfered with as well as living under an entirely arbitrary form of mastery that would nevertheless render him unfree. So to simply evaluate the slave's situation using the terminology of freedom would only confirm his lack of it and would not really get him very far. Yet according to Stirner, the slave, while he may not have freedom, still has ownness or a sense of himself and his interests. And this serves as a basis for the act of self-liberation, right? So he talks about how the slave will endure all of these, tortures and punishments and everything, all of these constraints, with a view to his own eventual self-liberation. There is, in other words, something that precedes freedom, something more elemental, which affirms the self even in the absence of freedom and even in the most oppressive of circumstances, and which acts as the spark that ignites the act of resistance. Egoism or ownness, and often these two terms are very closely associated with Stirner, is ontologically primary. It precedes freedom. And he says, in quotes, that I then become free from him and his whip, or, talking about the slave master, I become free from him, and his whip is only the consequence of my antecedent egoism. Right. So what comes first, he would say, is not freedom; it's egoism. Egoism becomes the sort of the ontological substance, if you like, from which the act of liberating or self-liberation arises. In other words, one had to have a sense of oneself, a sense of self-possession, before one could liberate oneself from a relationship of domination. The point here is that freedom simply cannot explain this act of liberation, as the slave had no freedom. Something else had to come before it, and this is the slave's ownness, which serves as a very limit of power and the point of resistance to it. So as it's deployed here, ownness is actually more empowering than freedom, and it points to something which is beyond both liberal negative accounts as well as Republican accounts of freedom. Now, it might be useful, I think, to try to understand this kind of elemental sense of the self, which ontologically precedes freedom, in terms of Foucault's notion of plebs. I don't know if you're familiar with that particular sort of aspect of Foucault's thinking, but he talks about this notion of plebs. So Foucault refers to a certain, what he calls plebeian quality that exists as the limit of power relations and serves as the ontological ground of resistance. And he says in quotes, but there is always something in the social body, in classes, groups, and individuals themselves, which in some sense escapes relations of power, something which is by no means, a more or less docile or reactive primal matter, but rather a centrifugal movement, an inverse energy, a discharge. So I think ownness can kind of help us understand this concept, right? So it points once again to the idea expressed in the concept of ownness, of freedom as the ontological ground on which the subject acts, rather than as a kind of a quantifiable substance strictly determined by the degree of constraint or domination one faces. So the advantage of thinking about freedom in this way is that it's more empowering for the individual. It shows that resistance is always possible, even in situations in which freedom is very strictly limited or very severely limited. It points to what can perhaps be seen as a dimension of self-abnegation or voluntary servitude at the basis of all power relations, the flip side of which is the reclamation of the self, or what Foucault called voluntary inservitude, wherein power relations can be radically overturned. So for Stirner, domination is as much a state of mind as a real material condition. And it's our recognition of our own status as slaves, or in Hegelian terms as servants, that makes the state's domination over us possible. He says in quotes, the state is not thinkable without lordship and servitude. He who to hold his own must count on the absence of will in others is a thing made by these others, as the master is a thing made by the servant. If submissiveness ceased, he goes on to say, it will be all over with lordship. So his point is that, all forms of power are really based upon a certain kind of denial of the self, a certain kind of self-domination or voluntary servitude, to speak in terms of Etienne de la Boissy, and that all acts of resistance and revolution and emancipation begin with, if you like, a kind of a reclamation or reaffirmation of the self. So we should think of ownness in terms of an ethical work conducted on ourselves so that the self may be affirmed over external constraints and power relations that appear to constrain it. So as I've suggested, ownness implies a form of self-possession, or what might be understood as self-mastery. The owner, for Stirner, is the one who not only has a sense of her own interests and a capacity for power, something that would make her a simple egoist, but not necessarily an owner. And this is where there's an important difference actually between egoism and ownness, I would say. But more importantly, the owner is one who has control over herself and her own desires. In other words, has possession over herself. And this is what separates Stirner's more sophisticated egoism from cruder accounts in which the individual simply pursues blind self-interest. Stirner, I think, has a much more interesting and sophisticated conception of egoism than that. Indeed, I would argue that Stirner's notion of ownness implies a certain ethical relationship to oneself, such that the individual is able to master her instincts, passions, and desires, even her desires for external objects or for power over others. So the opposite of self-possession, that which threatens self-mastery, is the state which Stirner refers to as possessiveness, being possessed. So he would say, you can be possessed by others, but you can also be possessed by your own desires, your own, uh, you know, drives and inclinations and passions to the point where you kind of lose control over yourself. So here one becomes mastered by one's own desires and passions rather than achieving mastery over them. The one who sacrifices himself on behalf of his selfish passions and desires for external objects is just as possessed as the one who sacrifices her desires on behalf of some obscure moral ideal. Both are ruled in their own way by a passion which is entirely one-sided and leads to an erosion of their self-mastery. They're both equally possessed by external objects that come to command their desires and lead to a sacrifice of other elements of their personality. So it's not that the individual should resist passions and desires, but that she should not allow herself to be controlled or overwhelmed by them. The owner always takes a certain distance from her own desires, such that she can master them. Stirner says, I am my own only when I am master of myself, indeed of being mastered either by sensuality or by anything else, such as God, man, authority, law, state, and church. So from Stirner's perspective, the homo economicus of liberalism and neoliberalism is a possessed, haunted person, a subject mastered precisely by external market forces and interactions which become internalized as desires. So ownness would seem to imply a certain kind of self-discipline, such that one can master one's own desires and appetites. Indeed, freedom requires a certain kind of discipline, including an ethical discipline one exercises over oneself in order to master and control the desires, tendencies, and dependencies that otherwise lead one to being susceptible to the power of others. In warning of the dangers of possessiveness, Stirner is invoking a certain understanding of freedom that comes through self-mastery and self-possession. Now, I would say here that there's a certain kind of, I guess you could say, superficial resemblance really with the notion of positive freedom, but only very superficial, right? So this notion of self-mastery is also what proponents of positive freedom talk about. But where I think the difference lies actually between Stirner's notion of ownness and the idea of positive freedom is that there's no sort of higher rational self which one should conform to and which one should as it were, subordinate the lower self to. So Stirner would not agree with Isaiah Berlin's definition of or understanding of the two selves, the higher rational self and the kind of the lower self, right? So that kind of normative idealization of the rational self, which is said to be more autonomous than the lower self, is very opposite to what Stirner is proposing here. Okay, so the distinction between ownness and positive liberty may be further clarified if we consider how Stirner understands subjectivity. Who or what precisely is the egoist or owner? So when Stirner talks about the owner or the individual egoist, he's not referring to a particular type of person, and he is not in any sense setting out to establish an essential form of subjectivity that we should copy or aspire to. The egoist is not a fixed or idealized subject with essential properties and characteristics, like the self-interested individual in liberalism, or the citizen in republicanism, or even the authentic self invoked in the concept of positive freedom. Rather, the egoist is an open, self-constituting immanence, an ontologically anarchic form of subjectivity. The egoist or owner is always in flux, always becoming, always consuming and inventing himself anew. The egoist is a subject without presuppositions, without a fixed identity or destiny. So Stirner says in quotes, I do not presuppose myself because I am at every moment just positing or creating myself. And am I only by not being presupposed but posited, and again posited only in the moment when I posit myself. That is, I am creator and creature in one. I am creator and creature in one. So this unfixity of the subject is how we should understand ontological freedom. The subject is, in Stirner's words, a creative nothing. The subject is free to constitute herself as she chooses without being encumbered by any sort of moral ideal or rational telos, or even any notion of an essential identity which defines for her certain characteristics or properties that are immutable or unchangeable. Quite simply, the subject cannot be pinned down to any specific category or identity, but evades these or escapes these in an ongoing process of self-constitution. So we should not think of freedom as an object to be attained or a goal to be achieved, but rather as an ontologically anarchic space of subjectification, which gives the individual the freedom to define her own singular path or multiple paths of freedom. Ownness then may be understood as a way, as Foucault put it, of not discovering what we are, but in quotes, of refusing not discovering what we are, but refusing what we are. In other words, refusing these kinds of preset or fixed identities. Right? In other words, it might be seen as a strategy of freeing oneself from the forms of identity that have been imposed upon us by contemporary forms of governmentality and constituting alternative modes of subjectivity. So Foucault talks about the attempt to, as he puts it, to get free of oneself, to get free of oneself. In other words, not be bound or limited by pre-existing and prescribed forms of subjectivity and ways of life, but to invent new ones. And this is not simply a question of resisting authority or maintaining a stance of pure opposition, as in some kind of naive libertarianism. Things are not so simple. And it's very difficult to, as Foucault showed, it's very difficult to actually get outside of power. Rather, it involves a reconstruction of our subjectivity, seeing ourselves and others in new ways, which are less likely to reproduce existing patterns of domination. And it's here that the Heideggerian philosopher Rainer Sherman, in his writings on Foucault, talks about, as he puts it, constituting oneself as an anarchist subject, constituting oneself as an anarchist subject. And so Sherman argues that anarchism is not so much a political principle, and it's even less a kind of a rational or scientific approach to social relations, as someone like Kropotkin might have argued, but rather as a mode of life, a way of living that is in a state of flux and is not bound by identity. The anarchist subject asks, as Sherman says, he asks not who am I or what is my essential truth, but rather what can I do, right? What can I do? How can I act given my specific situation and the conditions I find myself in? In other words, the anarchist subject is not concerned with establishing the eternal truth of his identity, but rather with acting within a world in a contingent way and constituting himself through his action. So by contrast, the doctrine of individualism, which is often promoted by liberal and particularly neoliberal ideology, is that which actually prevents the flourishing of the individual, because it imposes upon him or her forms of subjectivity, usually sort of coordinated by the market, forms of subjectivity and norms of behavior through which he's integrated into circuits of the capitalist market and thereby governed according to its dictates. Anarchism, or as I prefer to call it, post-anarchism, has nothing to do with this model of individualism, which is also what distinguishes it from anarcho-capitalism and various forms of libertarianism. Indeed, the figure of the individual, with his cherished natural rights and freedoms, is only the other side of the state apparatus that has constituted him in this way. So Foucault sees the modern state as a new form of pastoral power, and as he puts it, a matrix of individualization. And he says, Foucault says in quotes, I don't think we should consider the modern state as an entity that was developed above individuals, ignoring what they are and even their very existence, but on the contrary, as a very sophisticated structure in which individuals can be integrated under one condition, that this individuality be shaped in a new form and submitted to a very specific set of patterns. So yeah, his point is that, the state is not, he would say it's too simplistic to see the state as this kind of oppressive entity which simply suppresses individuals. Rather, he would say the state is what turns us into individual or subjectifies us in a certain kind of way. So it's therefore simplistic, indeed naive, to oppose the individual to the state, right? The individual is not the figure oppressed or dominated by the state, but rather the figure through which the state governs the modern subject, imposing upon him a set of conditions, norms, and modes of behavior to which he is expected to conform. So therefore, according to Foucault, modern political struggles are struggles around the meaning of the individual and the ways in which the individual has been constructed as a figure of political discourse. So as Foucault says in quotes, and he's talking about modern struggles that were emerging at the time which he was writing. He says they are struggles that question the status of the individual. On the one hand, they assert the right to be different and underline everything that makes individuals truly individual. On the other hand, they attack everything that separates the individual, breaks his links with others, splits up community life, forces the individual back upon himself, ties him to his own identity in a constraining way. These struggles are not exactly for or against the individual, he goes on to say, rather they are struggles against the government of individualization. And so my claim in this paper has been Stirner's notion of ownness as a radical form of freedom that forms the ontological basis of the subject. This allows us to actually better understand how these contemporary struggles can emerge and how they play out. Anyway, I will leave it there. Actually, I think it's just around 40 minutes, and yeah, and I'll welcome your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Saul. It was very interesting presentation and very amazing. So we can start our discussion, and I'll be first. So my question is there any connection between Stirner's understanding of insurrection and his Ownness theory? I mean, can we say that the Ownness is the ontological basis for insurrection or something like that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think they're very, very closely related, actually. So if you look at how Stirner understands the insurrection as opposed to the revolution, he says, the insurrection proceeds from the self. It's reclaiming the self. So he sees it as like an act of self-emancipation or self-liberation. It's not about creating a new form of society. It's not about creating new institutions. It's not even about actually getting rid of institutions. It's actually about asserting the self over institutions, right? So yeah, I suppose if you wanted to understand the politics of ownness, that's what the insurrection is. If you take this concept of ownness as sort of ontological freedom, which kind of lies with the egoist, with the owner, which is always part of him in a way, and you want to understand how that might, or what forms of political action might actually flow from that, then I think the insurrection is a very kind of interesting concept, really. And it's very different from revolution, which Stirner would say simply imposes a new form of society upon individuals, right? So the trouble with revolution is it always ends up with a new kind of state, or a new series of institutions which impose upon the individual a certain notion of freedom or a certain vision of freedom, which is always going to be a new kind of domination, essentially.
Thanks. So Dimash, please, you can start.
Thank you, Alexander. Thank you also, Saul Newman, for your lecture. It was very interesting. And my question is about the violence. And I had a little debate with other post-anarchists, and they claim that we should use only peaceful methods. We should use only peaceful means to achieve our ends. And I have a question. What Max Stirner specifically thinks about violence? And is there any difference between him and post-anarchists who are more advocates for peaceful methods? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, actually. So, I mean, I don't think Stirner really has much to say about violence specifically. The insurrection, I mean, when we talk about insurrection, we tend to think it's like a violent action of some kind, actually. But I think Stirner has something quite different in mind. I think he would say the insurrection is like a certain kind of insurrection against the self first and foremost, and he would actually see it as a form of ethical action, which may possibly take violent forms, but it may take non-violent forms as well. I mean, he's actually quite unclear about that. I mean, I don't think Stirner would necessarily be, morally opposed to violence as such, but I don't think that's really the kind of the emphasis of his, or the focus, if you like, of his conception of ownness. Actually, for me, the ownness is to be understood as like sort of an ethical relation to oneself as well as to others. But I mean, as you probably know, I mean, the question of violence is actually a very big debate within anarchist circles generally. I mean, some anarchists are pacifists and believe in non-violence, and there's a whole tradition of Tolstoy and Thoreau and Gandhi and so on, which says that violence is an illegitimate coercion of the individual. Whereas other anarchists, certainly historically, but even contemporary anarchists, believe that sometimes violence is necessary. I mean, to defend yourself, you need to sometimes engage in violence. And obviously, there's a whole tradition of kind of revolutionary anarchism, which goes back to back to the 19th century, where anarchists were kind of assassinating kings and presidents and industrialists and so on. So it's very much kind of an open question, I think, actually. And like I said, I don't think Stirner really has any sort of clear position on violence as such. But I just don't think that he would necessarily advocate violence. I mean, he says he might say perhaps sometimes it is necessary under certain circumstances, but I don't think that's really the kind of the main sort of focus of his understanding of egoism. So yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes,
You're
it
welcome.
is really interesting. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, Alina, please.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. It was indeed very interesting. And my question was, obviously, we have seen through the decades, probably more in the 20th century, ideas that are adjacent, we would say, to the theory of ownness, or ideas that are very similar, like existentialism philosophy is obviously sounds very familiar. And also, obviously, in sociology, the concept of agency or personal agency, which is, of course, not ontological, but it is still something that is we can say, a visible level of ownness. Ownness is an ontological characteristic.
Right.
It can be sometimes visible in social action through agency. And so my question was, have you maybe seen this theory of ownness by Stirner being incorporated by maybe critical theory or maybe identity politics? Because there are some interesting, I feel like there is an interesting relationship here in the sense that the theory of ownness seems to respond to some shortcomings of identity politics that are sometimes voiced. But at the same time, there is an obvious clash between ideological clash here. So maybe if you have seen more recent works that integrate Stirner in these kinds of works.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I mean, Stirner, I think, has been largely ignored, I would say, by the critical theory tradition generally, right? I mean, there's very little scholarship on Stirner. Part of that is to do with Marx and Engels' kind of radical rejection and parody of Stirner, actually, in the German ideology, where they accuse Stirner of just being essentially kind of an idealist who sort of ignores the material basis of power and the state and that kind of thing. And I think partly because of that sort of that condemnation of Stirner, Stirner's been largely neglected within that kind of critical theory tradition. There's certainly been quite a bit written about Stirner and existentialism. That's true, but that's perhaps coming from a different kind of tradition, actually. In fact, there's a book which came a long time ago called "Break Up from the Crystal Palace," which is on some Stirner, Dostoevsky, and Camus, I think, actually. And of course, Albert Camus himself wrote a chapter on Stirner and the Rebel. So I think there's a kind of a connection there with some kind of existentialism, certainly. So what can we say? I mean, yeah, identity politics. Yeah, so depends what you mean by identity politics, I suppose, doesn't it? I mean, as you can probably see from my paper, what I'm arguing is that Stirner, on one level, would be, or the kind of politics which Stirner is or has in mind, even though it's actually it's not very explicit or explicitly stated, is something which would reject identity politics, right? So, he would be against anything which confines the individual to a certain kind of, preset identity, whether it's identity based around sexuality or gender or ethnicity or religion or whatever, right? All of these things he would say are spooks, which which kind of, um, which kind of pin the individual to a certain kind of fixed series of norms and a fixed subjectivity. And his notion of the egoist is, as I've tried to suggest, this kind of open, fluid, unfixed, constantly sort of changing, constantly self morphing idea of the self, right? So it's really nothing which can be sort of slotted into a particular identity, and that actually makes identity politics very, very difficult to kind of relate to Stirner's notion of egoism. I suppose, on the other hand, you could say that that this theory of ownness that I'm talking about is really the basis, or could be the basis, of any kind of radical politics. I mean, this is so to engage in resistance. We need to start with this kind of, I suppose you could say, this kind of reclamation of the self, right? So the problem, as I see it, really is to do with this question of voluntary servitude, the way in which we kind of internalize certain kinds of domination, and we simply accept it. I mean, domination is not something which is forced upon us. Domination is often something which we kind of, as it were, voluntarily agree to and voluntarily internalize. So the to kind of emancipate ourselves, we have to kind of emancipate ourselves from ourselves, if you see what I mean. We have to kind of like detach ourselves from certain patterns of behavior or certain patterns of obedience or certain patterns of submission, which kind of allow power to be constituted. And so I think if you take that view of ownness as this kind of ontological freedom, which the subject always has, so even in conditions of domination, we always have this certain kind of sense of ourselves. And if we reclaim that, then this becomes the basis for any kind of radical politics, I would say generally. So it's not quite identity politics, but you could say that it's, I suppose, the emphasis on self-emancipation is something which might form the basis of even a certain kind of identity politics or any kind of radical politics or resistance at all.
Yes, because this is exactly the criticism of identity politics that is quite common, that in the fight for being seen and the fight against domination, people lose their own agency, and it becomes a bit of a process of self-victimization, even more so than the system does it for you.
Yes, exactly. That's right. I mean, like identity politics would be exactly what Foucault calls the kind of the form of, state politics of individualization. So it's quite easy for the state to kind of, in a way, incorporate these different identity groups, to give rights and to give recognition to certain kinds of minorities and that kind of thing. So to simply affirm a certain kind of identity, whether it's gay or trans or whatever. And I realize in your country that's a bit of a complicated issue, actually, because you have this sort of anti-LGBT legislation and that kind of thing. But you certainly, in kind of liberal societies, there's nothing necessarily radical in simply claiming recognition for a certain kind of identity group, if you like. I mean, because capitalism can usually incorporate these kinds of identities. So what Foucault talks about is refusing who we are, actually creating new modes of subjectivity, new modes of relating to one another, which are not kind of grouped around pre-established identities. And I think that's very much there in Stirner as well, actually, I would say.
Thank you.
So one question for you. Can you be more short when you answer the questions?
Right.
We have
time. Yeah.
More time. So Diana, please, you have a question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Dear Professor Newman, thank you so much for your extraordinary talk. And we're especially grateful that you accepted our invitation. That's a very precious fact for us, for Russian-speaking audience. So before asking my question, I would like to tell that I deeply resonate with your ideas. I accept them. That's why my question is not about your own ideas, but about the possible consequences in these days in modern in contemporary world, and that's what we are having right now. I know it's a huge question, but maybe you have a short outline. What's your opinion? Why people these days is it are they tired about this idea that subjectivity it's something contingent, it's something temporal, it's something deeply conditional, it's not mutual conditional. Why the consciousness of people want again to be fixed, to be strict, to be straight in some in terms of social class, in terms of gender, in terms of some classical metaphysical concepts. So why we're having right now? What is your opinion?
What's going on? Okay, so just so I understand what you're asking me, are you saying why do people conform to a certain kind of subjectivity or a certain kind of identity which has been fixed for them or preset for them or something, or is that what you're asking me?
After that all enlightenment which we had such a long time ago, at least 2 weeks, at least 2 centuries, we're definitely going back in terms of these ideas.
Oh, I see. So so that's a different kind of question, isn't it? I mean, we're going back to a kind of like a pre-enlightenment sort of
I know.
This is the counter-revolution. Yeah. Well, actually, I mean, Stirner would actually have a very succinct answer to that. He would say, well, this is political theology in the sense that this kind of that the religion has always been there even in modern forms of secularism and even in kind of Enlightenment thought, which was meant to in a way break with religious domination, and that humanist secularism is just simply another kind of religiosity reinvented, right? So he would say, so what we're seeing now, I suppose, is the I don't know, the manifestation of these very kind of reactionary ideas, which are always kind of there beneath the surface anyway, but they're just sort of coming out now as many of the sort of the illusions of the Enlightenment have been stripped away. So yes, we're certainly in a period of regression. But Stirner would say, well, that's always been there anyway, actually, just beneath the surface. So it's not surprising, in other words, that we're in a period of sort of global counter-revolution, because all of these Enlightenment revolutions didn't really free us anyway, I think. So anyway, I'm not allowed to elaborate because there's quite a lot of other questions. So I hope that's partly at least answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Alexander, please.
Yes, thank you. Alexander Tkachenko, State University, New York. And I have a question about historical context of Max Stirner. First, how do we say that he is successor of most radical thinkers of French Revolution, such as Marquis de Sade?
Maybe. But I mean, he's also very different from Marquis de Sade. I mean, I think he would just regard Marquis de Sade as a man who is possessed, a man who's possessed by his own passions, his own lusts, his own drives. I mean, I think Marquis de Sade would be the classic example of the non-master or the non-owner. But I understand what you mean, that Stirner is a very iconoclastic philosopher, like de Sade was. That he's really trying to overthrow the entire tradition, I would say, of Western philosophy, really, in a very kind of radical way. And this is why Stirner, I think, for me, is one of the most radical and revolutionary thinkers ever. He just regards really the whole tradition of Western philosophy as just being based upon abstractions and fixed ideas and spooks. They're certainly. They're both kind of revolutionary philosophers, I think, but perhaps in quite different ways. What's the connection that you see with Marquis de Sade?
Yes, I say it's radical individual freedom. It's absolute no limitation and liberation of individual from society, from all.
Yes, that's right. But I would say Stirner's understanding of individual freedom is much more sophisticated than de Sade. I mean, de Sade basically just says, do whatever you want, fuck whoever you want, I don't think Stirner's saying that actually. I think what he's saying is that it's okay to act upon your desires as long as you don't actually become taken over by those desires. So I think it's more reflective, it's more ethical. His notion of individual liberation is much more ethical, I would say, than Marquis de Sade's, because it also refers to a kind of a certain relationship one has with oneself. So he says, we have to be able to also to be free or to be owned. We actually have to be able to master those passions and not be sort of taken over by them. And that's
Yes.
Yeah.
Probably his ideas were more fine or more ethical, like you belong to other Junghelianer, like Karl Marx or somebody else. Okay, second question about predecessors of Stirner.
Right.
He has this very similar idea of three-step individual evolution, like Nietzsche. Nietzsche in Also sprach Zarathustra has the same idea that every individual has three steps of evolution. Is their ideas related?
Well, there's a big debate about that actually. The degree to which Stirner might have influenced Nietzsche. I mean, Stirner came slightly before Nietzsche, as you probably know. There's no evidence that Nietzsche read Stirner, but I think some of their ideas are quite similar. I don't know about. I mean, the three steps would be as probably more closely related to Stirner's to the Hegelian influence of Stirner, I would say, rather than anything to do with Nietzsche, right? So Stirner talks about the three stages of egoism. The kind of the the sort of the childish egoism, the more the more sort of mature forms of egoism, which which only come with ownness, really. But at the same time, they're also very, very different thinkers, I would say, Stirner and Nietzsche. I mean, Stirner had no nostalgia for any kind of aristocratic system of ideas and values in the way that Nietzsche did. Stirner, I think,
it's also a liberation of any morality, liberation of mind. It's three steps to Nietzsche's Übermensch.
Yeah, but for Stirner, there's no real Übermensch. I mean, for Nietzsche, the Übermensch is like this sort of higher set of values, right? Whereas Stirner wouldn't talk in those terms. He would say, well, there is no higher set of values, right? It's simply the egoist starting from himself and creating himself and creating the world, from his own position, really. I don't think that's really translate, or I don't think it really parallels Stirner's notion. Sorry, Nietzsche's notion of the Übermensch. There's no hierarchy in Stirner, right? In the way that there is in Nietzsche. There's no moral hierarchy, or I think that's.
I just have heard already this hypothesis. These two concepts are related. Therefore, I wanted to clarify for you. And closer to our time, Paul Feyerabend. He has this.
Feyerabend, did you say?
Paul Feyerabend.
Feyerabend, yes. Okay,
He has this epistemological anarchism.
Yes, that's right.
There is relationship for Nietzsche. It's most interesting for me as liberation of science and liberation.
Yeah, against method. It's a very I've written a bit about Feyerabend, not so much directly in relation to Stirner, but I mean certainly in relation to epistemological anarchism. Yes, I suppose there's a connection there. I don't think Feyerabend talks about Stirner in his book. And Feyerabend also distances himself from the anarchist tradition to some extent. He not says it's not the anarchism of Kropotkin and Proudhon and Bakunin. It's an anarchism of scientific method. So it doesn't translate into any kind of politics, he would say. But no, I mean certainly there's I suppose in rejecting what we might call fixed ideas, you could say, well, that's also what Paul Feyerabend is doing. Right, in rejecting, certain kinds of epistemological methods or certain kinds of, scientific practices which are established and which have legitimacy simply because they're the mainstream or they're the ones that are supported by institution, right? So, yeah,
we can see it today. Today many technological things as progress, scientific progress is done by some individuals with free of students.
Sure, that's true. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Denise, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you a lot for your presentation.
Mm.
So I have one quick remark and one kind of Hegelian objection. So first I go with a remark. From your presentation, I've noticed striking similarities to Buddhism. Yet
Buddhism, right?
the vocabulary that Stirner used is, well, I would say it's unfortunate because it goes in completely different direction. So even the epigraph to his book, ich habe meine Sache auf nichts gestellt, so I've put my thing on nothing, right? Basically, it's kind of nothingness in terms of thinking substance. So like, and yeah, the title of the book, das Eigentum, so the property. So it goes to the wrong direction, I think. So perhaps, yeah. So yeah, the vocabulary is unfortunate.
Yes.
It should be more about disowning the properties and like
Yes.
the very relation of property, actually, some would claim, is a highly imperialistic one. So like, being owned by somebody, right? So it's already kind of like expression of some kind of coercion, like domination and so on and so on. Even if it is myself that I own, right?
Yeah.
And the objection. So I think, well, maybe like it's avoidable in his theory, but I think that the suggestion misses the point of real societal change. So I mean, like at any point of time, so given any societal circumstances, so any change should always go through a category or like institutionalization. And that should be always a new one. So like, I mean, like in generational terms, for instance. So think of beatniks, hippies, punks, I don't know, whoever else, right? So this critical impetus should always assume a new form. And this creative freedom always has to have some kind of social expression because, well, otherwise it will be like, null and void because, well, just like, fantasies. Right? So, and yet those categories or identities that allow for expression of freedom and societal change are always in flux. So, I mean, like now it would be making little to no sense to like, be a punk, like, in the spirit of the 60s or 70s and so on. Anyway, so like for liberation, we always need to have a category, an institution or something. There are also like, civil rights movements. I mean, like, has to have well, consequences in the real world, not just like my own thinking.
Yeah.
So
no,
and
okay.
just one more thing. Basically, yeah. So if we insist on pure nothing and its own, then we kind of seem to be locked in the confines of pure demands to act without any possibility of any determinate content at all. So and Hegel would call it like empty Sollen ought to. That Hegel so directed his criticism towards Kant and Fichte.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so I don't think Stirner is against, well, he's probably against institutions, but I think he's not necessarily against certain forms of political action. He's not even against the revolution. So if you read his discussion on the insurrection as opposed to the revolution, he says, that okay, they're very different forms of political action, but the revolution can in a way spring from the insurrection. So I think he wants to understand that kind of that initial moment or act of self-liberation from which new forms of politics can actually emerge. Whether they're social movements or whether they're even new social forms, right? So he's not, in other words, he's not against the concept of actually changing society or social change. He's not against that. But what he says is that all of that springs from this kind of, from the self initially. And I think in a way he's right. I mean, we have to look at where does the sort of the act of where does political change come from? It has to firstly come from the self, doesn't it? It's not something which can, it's not something which can simply be imposed by an institution as such. I mean, it's something which firstly has to spring from the self and from this kind of voluntary inservitude, this kind of reclamation of the self from existing forms of the self. Well, it's existing forms of the self or participation within existing forms of social relations, which create these systems of domination. So we have to, in a way, kind of withdraw from this or abstract ourselves from this or escape from this and kind of, if you like, return to the self. And out of this comes, perhaps new forms of politics. So my point simply is that Stirner is not against the idea of social change, but I think is more interested in exploring this kind of dimension of ontological freedom from which social change can actually emerge. I mean, on the question of Buddhism, yeah, that's quite interesting, actually. I mean, certainly, when Stirner talks about nothingness and the self being nothing, and that sounds very close to Buddhism. But you're right. Perhaps some of the language that he uses, property and that kind of thing makes that relationship very, very problematic in some ways. But yeah, the way I prefer to read Stirner, actually, I'm not saying that he's a Buddhist, but I mean, there's a certain kind of interesting parallel, I would say, with the idea of the self being like a nothing, and the nothing out of which new forms can actually emerge. The self creating nothing. Yeah, that's a very interesting idea. This kind of void. The self is a void, basically. Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. So Stepan, and after Stepan, we have two questions in our chat, and after that we will start.
Right,
So
finish.
Stepan, please.
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you very much for the lecture. It was really interesting and engaging. And I'm personally really curious about your thoughts on Marxist reading of Stirner, and especially the connection between Stirner's approach and theoretical anti-humanism, to use Althusser terms, and critique of a liberal concept of subjectivity and the idea of the man, which Althusser connects with liberal tradition and capitalism also. This is my question.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So one of the theories out there is that when Althusser talks about the epistemological break in Marx's thought between his early humanism and his later materialism, one of the theories is that was precisely because of Marx's encounter with Stirner, right? So Marx, as you know, Marx sort of shifted from a kind of more of a humanist position to the materialist position around the time that the German ideology was written, and so you can see the German ideology as this kind of this kind of expression of this very sort of problematic relationship with Stirner, because Stirner in a way exposed the humanism of Marx, didn't he? Or he exposes the idealism of Marx's early humanism. So I think there's I think that encounter with Stirner is actually very, very important for Marx, and so the whole German ideology is like a repudiation of Stirner, as you know. He accuses Stirner of the same kind of idealism, which in a way Stirner was sort of accusing Marx of engaging in. I think I don't know if Althusser actually wrote or mentioned Stirner at all. He might have mentioned him very, perhaps in passing or something. But I do see Stirner as being really a very kind of pivotal influence on Marx's thought. I mean, Marx, and actually originally I think Engels was certainly quite positive about Stirner's concept of egoism. He would say, the proletariat firstly has to become egoistic before it can have a revolution. Has to kind of discover its egoism, and what he meant by that was it has to become sort of conscious of itself as a class of producers. So there was this kind of initial positive reception of Stirner, but then I think Marx kind of realized in a way Stirner sort of exposed the sort of the idealism behind his own philosophy, and that's why he kind of turned against him.
Thank you very much for your answer.
Thank you.
Sorry, Alexander, can I ask one more question?
Only short. Very
Yes,
very
only
short.
short. Yes, very short. Yes, so I have a question regarding the union of egoists. So you didn't mention it in your presentation, but why anarchists did not prefer union of egoists but prefer cooperatives, affinity groups, or autonomous zones? Why there is a gap?
Well, it depends
on
how
this?
you understand the union of the egoists. I mean, in some ways, you could see the affinity group as being quite close to the union of egoists, I would say. I mean, the whole idea of the union of ego. I mean, Stoner's not against collective action, right? I mean, what he says is that people can come together around some kind of common problem or common political struggle, as long as they're not dominated by it, as long as that doesn't become like a permanent community or a permanent collective or a state or a new kind of society, right? So he's against anything which kind of subordinates the individual as a member of a group to the group itself. And that's quite close, I would say, to certain forms of anarchist political association, which kind of reject, vanguards and centralized control and that kind of thing, and revolutionary leadership. So I think even though people make fun of the idea of the union of egos, I actually think it's quite an interesting concept. It's a way of trying to understand the tension, if you like, between the individual and the community, and trying to kind of think about how we can actually do politics collectively without, in a way, sacrificing or subordinating the individual to that to that sort of common purpose of common struggle. So I would say anarchists should be a bit more sympathetic, I would say, to the idea of the union of egos, because it's actually quite close to anarchism, basically.
Yeah, but it's not so popular, sadly.
No, it's not. No, it's not. It's not, because I think a lot of people misunderstand Stirner, and there's a big debate actually about whether Stirner should really be included within the anarchist tradition at all. Actually, I mean, Stirner is very, very difficult to kind of categorize into a particular ideology, isn't it? I mean, he's quite, in some ways, he's quite close to a certain kind of anarchism.
Yeah.
On the other hand, he obviously breaks with the kind of the humanist rationalist version of anarchism, which we would find in the classical anarchist tradition, right? So, I believe anarchism should be a broad church, so to speak, and should include Stirner, because I think is very interesting corrective to some of the theoretical limitations of anarchism.
Thank you, Saul. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Saul. And there are two questions from our chat. So Yelena asks, have you addressed the Russian tradition of anarchism in your studies? If so, which problems would you identify as close to those you discuss?
The Russian tradition, did you say?
Yep, Russian tradition.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, my concept of post-anarchism is something which emerges in part through a certain kind of critique, or at least a deconstruction of the anarchism of Bakunin, Kropotkin, and sort of Russian anarchism generally. But I mean, not just Russian anarchism, but also what I call the classical anarchist tradition of the 19th century. Right. So what I argue basically is that form of anarchism is based upon a certain kind of in the case of Kropotkin, a certain kind of biologism, a certain sort of evolutionary theory. I mean, Kropotkin's whole theory of mutual aid, which kind of emerges as a sort of natural organic instinct within human beings. So what I argue is that within that kind of classical tradition, there's a certain sort of humanism and a kind of a rationalism, and almost like a positivist vision of social relations and natural laws, which I think in a way isn't really theoretically tenable today. So I prefer to think of anarchism really as not so much as this kind of not so much in terms of like a social rationality or even like an ideal society, but rather as a form of political action which starts with ontological anarchy. So it's an anarchism without these kinds of kind of humanist, rationalist, and enlightenment conceptions of man, society, the universality of reason, natural law, and that kind of thing. It kind of in a way rejects some of those ideas.
Yep. Okay. And one more question. How do you understand freedom as escaping from power of narratives? Please give some examples.
What do you mean the power of narrative? I can't talk to the person, can I? What do you mean by the power of narratives? I'm a bit unclear about that.
Svetlana, can you explain what do you mean? Because that's not my question. That's question from chat.
Yeah.
I read this idea from your book, Post-Anarchism. You wrote about the power of narratives and idea escaping from this power. Maybe I don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I would have used the term narrative. That doesn't sound familiar to me, actually. So perhaps you have something in mind when you think about narratives. What do you mean by that, or what do you take from that? I don't know. Do you mean, like, when you say narrative, do you mean discourses? Is that what you mean, or?
Yes, as is discourse.
Yeah, but what discourse of what? Or what discourses do you have in mind?
In political thought, in religion thought, in literature and others.
Okay. I mean, yeah. I mean, post-anarchism is, yeah, it's a deconstruction, you might say, of dominant discourses, right? So whether the liberal discourses of freedom and rights, or humanist discourses, or so it takes a kind of a deconstructive position, in the sense it tries to look at some of the contradictions within dominant narratives, and some of the discursive limitation within those dominant narratives. But I don't think I necessarily refer that to literature or narratives in that kind of broad sense that you mean. I mean, I think I'm referring more to like philosophical concepts and philosophical traditions, right? So yeah, I mean, I mean, post-anarchism in part is a sort of a philosophical maneuver, right? So it's trying to update anarchism as a kind of a way of thinking about politics and thinking about political action. This is why I think Stirner is so vital here in this move, because Stirner, in a way, shows that all of these narratives are basically ideological constructions, and they're spooks. They have no kind of basis in reality, and not only that, they kind of they lead to new forms of oppression and domination. So I think my point would be that if we want to free ourselves, we have to, in a way, kind of break free from some of these dominant narratives. We have to learn to sort of see ourselves differently, and to kind of invent new ways of living, new ways of understanding ourselves. Right. So yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
I ask another question.
Yeah.
How do you see the idea of Christian anarchism as whole?
Christian anarchism, did you say? How do I say it? I mean, I'm quite interested in Christian anarchism. I don't think Stirner would like the idea very much, because he was against any kind of religion, really. But there's Christian anarchism. I mean, I've written a bit about Christian anarchism in my book on political theology. There's certainly some parallels there, I would say, between Christianity and anarchism. And I'm referring here to thinkers like, what's the guy's name? I can't remember the guy. He's a French thinker, actually, who wrote the book on. That's right. Yeah. So he says, if you read the Sermon on the Mount, and if you look at some of the kind of the principles of Christianity, that they're quite close to anarchism, in the sense that they're about kind of separating oneself from the state, and basically withdrawing from institutionalized forms of power, and creating, I guess creating an alternative society within the existing society, based upon kind of equality and so on. So there's a certain it's an important tradition within anarchism, actually, and I certainly don't dismiss it. But I don't think Stirner would have much in common with it, I would say.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, the last question, please, Stepan.
All right, I'm going to have to go soon, I'm afraid. So if you just make it quick.
It's okay. I don't have any more questions. Thank you very much.
All right.
Okay. Saul, thank you again
Okay.
Thank you again for your presentation. It was really amazing, and our discussion was very good and very interesting. I hope some in the future we can make a lot of another meeting. And of course, we have a lot of interesting questions for you, but sorry, we have no time. I'm really sorry for it. So I hope that was interesting for you, sure. And that was thanks, thank you, thank you.
Okay.
And so see you soon.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for your questions and your interest, and hopefully we'll talk again soon.